This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Chinese President Xi Jinping set to attend the annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. We have an update from Sudan after the African Union suspended the country from participation in its activities. And the World Health Organization raises the alarm about a high number of undetected Ebola cases in DR Congo. Hello and welcome to Africa Live on CGTN with me, Beatrice Marshall, in Nairobi. Also coming up this hour, the South African rand drops to a new low as wrangles over the role of the central bank continue. And the winners of a bridge competition in Nigeria designed to raise awareness about China, its language and culture. We begin in Russia, where Chinese President Xi Jinping will attend the annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum this evening. He arrived in Russia's second-largest city on Thursday and was given an honorary doctorate degree at St. Petersburg State University. Here's more.
The two leaders attended a ceremony at the school hall where President Xi Jinping was awarded an honorary doctorate degree. Xi thanked the university for the honor. He said the historic university is home to many famous scholars and masters in various fields, including science, culture, and education. He also praised the school's impressive Chinese courses. Xi said education is the bridge between two different cultures and a channel for friendship. In April, China's Tsinghua University, President Xi Jinping's alma mater, awarded President Putin an honorary doctorate degree as well. Xi said at Thursday's ceremony that the exchanges of honorary degree are proof of the quality of bilateral educational and cultural cooperation and impetus for future ties in these fields. He also said the youth carries the hope for human progress and the power for continuing friendships. He encouraged young people to build more bilateral connections as China and Russia mark the 70th anniversary of their diplomatic ties this year. Putin congratulated Xi on receiving the degree. He echoed Xi's sentiments, saying the academia plays a big part in bilateral exchanges. He applauded the efforts by institutions like the St. Petersburg State University in conducting academic and people-to-people exchanges. He added more talents are needed for the successful collaborations between Russia's Eurasia Economic Union and the China-initiated Belt and Road Initiative. The ceremony concluded with the St. Petersburg Choir singing songs for friendship.
The leaders of Eurasia's two largest countries continued their discussions on Thursday in President Putin's hometown, St. Petersburg. The pair started their day by admiring the scenery along the Neva River and again agreed to promote more people-to-people exchanges. Xi and Putin then moved to the Winter Palace north of the city. There, President Xi stressed that the two sides should deepen strategic coordination not only to protect the interests of China and Russia, but also to defend international norms and promote peace and stability. Putin agreed the two nations work together more, especially in international affairs. Economic cooperation tops the agenda of President Xi's visit to Russia. The two countries' leaders have signed joint communiques reaffirming their commitments to cooperation in many fields. That includes coordination under the China-initiated Belt and Road Initiative and the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. The two sides say they believe the programs can complement each other to promote regional development. Russia has become an avid supporter of the Belt and Road Initiative. 6 years since its launch, bilateral cooperation under the Belt and Road has seen progress in infrastructure and trade. Take a look.
A key issue for China-Russia cooperation under the Belt and Road Initiative. The connection between the BRI and the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union is of great strategic significance. Established in 2015, the EAEU is a group consisting of Russia, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. It seeks to optimize the flow of goods and services among its members, while at the same time achieving mutual benefits with the BRI. In 2015, Russia and China agreed to integrate the BRI with the EAEU construction, and an agreement on trade and economic cooperation was reached last year. On a hardware level, China and the EAEU will enhance interconnection in logistics and transportation, as well as infrastructure projects. Efforts are also being made on software synergy. Trade facilitating mechanisms will be set up in developing areas to create common policies and reduce trade barriers, and also study the long-term objective of establishing a free trade zone. Aside from strategic coordination, there are more pragmatic results between China and Russia under the BRI framework. In 2018, bilateral trade hit a record high, reaching $107 billion, with results already reached in traditional cooperative areas. China and Russia are also seeing an optimized trade structure with new growth in high-tech, finance, e-commerce, and tourism industries. 2019 will also be a fruitful year. 2 new bridges under construction over the Amur River between Russia and China are expected to be completed, and the jointly built Power of Siberia gas pipeline will be put into service at the end of this year. It is expected to provide China with 38 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually. Jen Kwan, CGTN.
To our continuing coverage of the transition in Sudan. The African Union has now suspended Sudan from all African Union activities. The bloc says the country will regain its rights once there is a civilian-led transitional authority. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is set to visit Khartoum to mediate between Sudan's military rulers and an opposition alliance. Coletta Wanjohi has more from Addis Ababa.
The African Union Peace and Security Council says its decision to suspend Sudan is unanimous. It held an emergency meeting here in Addis Ababa to discuss the crisis in the country.
Suspend, as of today, the participation of the Republic of Sudan in all AU activities till the effective establishment of a civilian-led transitional authority as the only way to allow the Sudan to exit from the current crisis.
Sudan's military is accused of killing at least 100 peaceful protesters. Since the removal of President Omar al-Bashir from power earlier this year, the military and the country's people have failed to agree on a transition plan. The AU also issued a stern warning.
Council further decides that should the transition military council fail to hand over power to a civilian-led transitional authority without any further delay, Council will automatically impose punitive measures on individuals and entities that are obstructing the establishment of a civilian-led transitional authority.
The AU says the punitive measures will be decided with time. Sudan's military has announced that it will hold elections after 9 months, but the African Union says it must have the backing of the civilians on this. Coletta Wanjohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Meanwhile, a Sudanese Ministry of Health official has said 52 people have been killed in Khartoum and another 9 in other parts of the country after the army launched a crackdown on protesters earlier this week. The military ousted President Omar al-Bashir in April following months of protests, but thousands of protesters had remained camped out in front of army headquarters, calling for the generals to hand over power to a civilian transitional administration. The crackdown on their sit-in was condemned by the UN Secretary General, Britain and the United States. The country's ruling generals, however, insist that the move was a cleanup operation that went wrong and deny having forcibly broken up the sit-in.
The number of dead people who have been identified until now is 43. We still have more bodies which haven't yet been identified.
Interim Algerian President Abdelkader Ben Salah has called for dialogue after authorities ruled out holding a planned election on July the 4th. Ben Salah, the former Upper House Speaker, was appointed on April the 9th to replace Abdelaziz Bouteflika under constitutional rules which state a presidential election must then be held within 90 days. Algeria's Constitutional Council said it was impossible to stage a presidential poll after the only two candidates were rejected.
I call upon the political class and civil society and political figures who love their country. I urge you all to opt for an inclusive dialogue in order to draw a roadmap to help the state plan an election as soon as possible.
In Zimbabwe, government officials have held talks with a European Union delegation. The meeting is part of ongoing efforts to restore normal relations. As CGTN's Farai Mwakutuya tells us from Harare, the meeting is being described as frank and constructive.
It's been a long time since Zimbabwean and EU officials have sat across the table from each other. They did just that on Wednesday, the first get-together in a series of meetings that are expected to speed up the thawing of relations, specifically with the European bloc, but also to add momentum to Zimbabwe's international reintegration. The milestone talks focused on several matters of mutual interest.
Investment, trade and economic development, climate change and its humanitarian impact, human rights, democracy, good governance and the rule of law, development cooperation, and regional and international cooperation. The dialogue, as I said in my opening statement, was conducted in a frank, constructive, and cordial atmosphere and paved the way for enhanced cooperation between the Republic of Zimbabwe and the European Union.
The EU, which has progressively lifted sanctions on top government and ruling party officials, says it's committed to working with Zimbabwe on an equal footing to implement a raft of economic and political reforms.
We think that the government is serious with this reform agenda, and we've seen positive steps taken in terms of the constitutional alignment. New legal proposals are coming up and that testifies about the seriousness of the government of moving forward. Also, that the fact that there is now a staff-monitored program by the IMF.
Following this positive start, the two parties have agreed to a second round of talks in November. Those will measure progress against the benchmarks, but crucially add impetus to this re-engagement effort that should culminate in the lifting of all remaining embargoes on the Southern African nation. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
You're watching Africa Live, still ahead on the program. The World Health Organization raises the alarm about a high number of undetected Ebola cases in DR Congo. And the winners of a bridge competition in Nigeria designed to raise awareness about China, its language and culture. Coming up after the break.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
reporting from Nairobi City Center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference. Africa Live. Find your voice.
And now to a surprising research finding. In its first ever report on child grooms, the United Nations Children's Education Fund, UNICEF, says at least 115 million boys and men around the world got married as children. Of these, 1 in 5 children, or 23 million, were married before the age of 15. Conducted in 82 countries, the study shows the practice is prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific. The Central African Republic leads the African continent with child marriages among males at 28%. Early child marriage has often been synonymous with girls, but the new UN report is changing that narrative, as boys too, it appears, are also victims. And to further discuss these findings on child marriages, I'm joined in studio by James Elder. He's the UNICEF Regional Chief of Communication, Eastern and Southern Africa. James Elder, thank you for joining us here on Africa Live. Some surprising research findings there, because we often talk about early child marriages as synonymous with a girl child. Now, 115 million boys and men around the world have gotten married as children. What is the significance of this report by UNICEF regarding marriage?
Yeah, you're spot on. We do talk about girls and we need to, but when it comes to boys, no one's ever done this research before, and it's a very, very large number, and it means that in the same way that girls are losing that childhood, they're losing that chance to get an education, to be a good mum, boys are having their childhood stolen. Invariably they become husbands, they become dads, because that tends to follow, and you've got 16 and 17-year-olds who are still children suddenly trying to look after a family. So the significance is you not only steal their childhood, but invariably then they don't have the skills, they've left school, they can't go on to get the kind of work that they look for, and they get into the type of labour and cheap employment that is never going to suit them, that will invariably lead them to a life of poverty, perpetuates their poverty for a whole group of society who hopefully we're going to look after a family. So
we're looking at the 17, 18, 15-year-olds and we're saying, you know, there are economic repercussions that come as a result of the early marriages there. But what are the factors that are making these young boys, though, susceptible to marriage?
Yeah, you're dead right on the economic factors. Just on that, we know, for example, that when young people, boys and girls, stay in school, they tend to add about 10% to future income for every year they stay in school. So there's a right in principle and a right in practice argument for this. Now, why is it happening? You know, a lot of it comes from the right place. Communities think they're actually trying to end poverty, although they're actually exacerbating it. They think they're protecting their kids. Invariably, that's not the case, because you add all sorts of health risks again to boys and girls when they marry young. And then there's a lot of customary, religious and traditional things that societies have. What's very important then is that you have this conversation, and that's what UNICEF tries to do, to be part of communities and to listen to what why they're doing this, and for us then to explain to them why delaying marriage makes such a difference for girls and for boys.
UNICEF report lists sub-Saharan Africa as one of the regions where this is common, or this is quite prevalent. So in terms of Africa, though, what should authorities do in Africa to eradicate, you know, the early child marriages for boys, as well as talking about the girl child?
Yeah, I think two big things. One is to make that economic argument. The more that people understand just how much economic return there is for societies, in my world, in development, there literally isn't anything you can do that has a bigger impact for society and for the economy than keep kids in school. give them a quality education. And when you marry boys and marry girls, they leave school. So that's a huge one. And then within that, legislation is key. You do need those laws in place, but we know that there are countries with good laws and not the practice. So then the next part for governments is to make sure that communities are having this discussion, create an open space so that communities, because this is invariably in rural areas, make sure that people know, firstly, there's a law in place, but secondly, why for your society, for that community that people are trying to build up, while you actually do the opposite. You do damage to it by marrying off girls and boys.
So as a final pointer and breaking it down for us, though, give us a breakdown of exactly what is the impact in the lives of boys when this happens.
I think the main one is they're out of school. The next one is a generational impact, which is basically we now know that the biggest influence you can have on kids is not an expensive one. It's about when you've got a 1-year-old or a baby, a 2-year-old, it's about knowing how to play with them, it's about knowing the right food to give them. Those things don't cost a lot of money, but they do necessitate that you've had an education and that you're strong in yourself. So if you're a 23-year-old, 26-year-old, you know a bit about yourself, you know a little bit about nutrition, you know how to play with a child. That doesn't cost anything, that's just about basic stimulation. But if you're a child yourself, having a child, you don't know these things. So the real cost is that you just continue this cycle of poverty. You steal one childhood and you bring a new child in with giving them a parent who doesn't have the ability to bring them up in the way that kids so desperately need. All right, James Elder, we'll leave it there for the moment, but thank you very much on that very surprising report on the plight of the boy child. Let's now go to Uganda, where concerns are being raised about the safety of people living in hilly areas that are prone to landslides in the latest incident. 6 people died after heavy rains triggered a series of landslides in the eastern part of the country. CGTN's Brian Toussaint gives us more details.
According to the Uganda Red Cross Society, Tuesday night's landslides left about 150 houses destroyed. 50 people were not immediately accounted for. The charity organization was quoted saying at least 27 people had been injured, and around 350 more were forced to leave their homes. The Uganda Red Cross Society is warning that similar tragedies are likely to occur due to ongoing rainfall. It also says there is a likelihood of cases of pneumonia in children, as well as outbreaks of cholera. Bududa district, which lies on the border between Uganda and Kenya, is a high-risk area for landslides. In 2018, at least 41 people were killed after a river in the region burst its banks. In 2010, at least 100 people were killed in a landslide. According to local authorities, over 100,000 people living on the slopes of Mount Elgon are estimated to be at great danger and need to be relocated. Brian Toussaint, CGTN.
To some health concerns coming from the DRC now, and roughly a quarter of Ebola infections could be going undetected or found too late. That's according to a World Health Organization expert. The expert warns that this could severely hamper response efforts.
It's nearly a year now since the latest Ebola outbreak hit the Democratic Republic of Congo. There have been over 2,000 cases and more than 1,000 deaths recorded in the province of North Kivu and Ituri. But officials fear the figures could be far from the real picture, as many cases go undetected. Movement of people, health-seeking behavior, where people seek treatment from other health zones, have been cited as major drivers of the epidemic.
The $1 billion question is, how big is that number? We believe at this point, and let me be very cautious here. We believe that we're probably detecting in excess of 75% of cases. We may be missing up to a quarter of cases.
The WHO is also concerned on growing attacks on aid workers and civilians. A local official said 13 civilians were killed late Monday by a group thought to be linked to ISIL. The WHO is now calling for greater political engagement to help combat the outbreak.
When someone dies in the community, it's a disaster. It's a disaster for the community, but it's a disaster for the response, because that person has been in the community potentially infecting others. So we must get earlier detection of cases. We must have more exhaustive identification of contacts. We need to convince all of those contacts to accept vaccination.
This is the second worst Ebola outbreak in the country's history, but the 10th time it has hit the DRC. Michael Karanja, CGTN.
And despite these fears, the World Health Organization says the last 2 weeks has seen a decline in Ebola cases in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
We need to be exceptionally cautious, but we also need to have hope that the measures that have been put in place over the last 6 weeks and before are beginning to bear some operational fruit. But we need to remain exceptionally cautious. We need to work very, very hard over the coming weeks to ensure that any gains that we are making are sustained, and we need to be very aware that this virus will exploit any opportunity that it gets to increase transmission, and most importantly in that is our continued fear is further violence that would disrupt the operations in the field.
Well, the Ebola outbreak in the DRC is a big concern for aid organizations. CGTN spoke to El Haj As-Sai. He is the Secretary General for International Federation of the Red Cross. He's of the view that more community engagement is needed in the battle against the deadly virus.
We have not yet contained this outbreak. Too long, too severe, and then the cases, continuing, to emerge, new cases being registered every week. This is really unfortunate. And why? Because this outbreak is happening in a region that is also impacted by conflict. Access is an issue, security is an issue, safety of volunteers as well as health care workers. We're losing staff that are also on the ground trying to save lives, resistance of communities and misunderstanding of the communities. Because we are paying now, we, the government, and then the whole development humanitarian sector together, a price of neglect. Communities that have been too long in poverty, too long without health service, too long without any kind of support. Now, only when Ebola comes, we all come in focusing on Ebola only without taking into account the other needs of the community, but also the fears of the communities. That led to resistance. Now, that we're learning now is that we have to reset the whole approach to put the communities in the center. Outbreaks start with communities, and if they end, they will have to end in the communities. The communities' engagement, accountability towards them, their participation, role of local leaders, and then role of also local volunteers and neighbors, will be very important, because it is a very dangerous outbreak. It's a matter of life and death. How can you build a trust to somebody to give you his or her loved one to care for with a great probability that this person will not come back alive? How can you convince someone who have a loved one who is deceased that they cannot bury them the way they used to? You have to do it in a safe and dignified manner, but then you are the one who will do it on their behalf, which means that they change their burial practice, their mourning practice. This requires a long-term commitment. And the way to do it is to be there on the side of the communities all the time, not only when we have an outbreak. We have to be there before, to be there during, and to be there after. And I think if we do that, we will build the necessary trust that will be leading to a better response to outbreaks like Ebola. The best situation and the best mechanism would have been to have peace, so that we have an enabling environment, for the work to happen, so that our doctors will not be shot, while providing services, that the treatment centers will not be torched down. That would be the ideal situation. But this is a crisis situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Kivu region that we've been experiencing for almost 30 years. That's why we believe that now our best bet is to have that community engagement and participation to create the safe space and an enabling environment, and negotiating with all parties in the conflict, to really focus on what is meaningful and what is beneficial to the communities and provide the safe space for response. It continues to be very dangerous, very ambiguous, but for us humanitarians, it is in those places where we are needed most, and we will have to be there on the side of the communities.
2 university students in Nigeria have emerged winners in this year's bridge competition organized by the Confucius Institute for students learning the Chinese language. The competition is designed to help the students learn more about China, its language and culture. CGTN's Deji Badmos has more on that story.
16 university students drawn from the 2 Confucius Institute in 2 universities in Nigeria are taking part in the bridge competition. At stake, these trophies and a chance to represent Nigeria in a bigger competition in Beijing sometime in July. The competition covers areas such as the Chinese language, talent and culture. Observing and scoring the contestants is this panel of judges. The contest begins with a quiz or question and answer session for the contestants.
C. 宁夏 D. 云南开始。我的答案是 D. 云南。回答正确。
Up next, the talent category.
回头看见鹰抓兔，放下步，落下去，看前去追河兔。
把家放大，就变成了世界。
And then, the unscripted speech-making session.
他没有忘记还在艰难发展的非洲兄弟。
And finally, the dance. And when the judges finally turn in their results, it's these contestants who emerge overall winners, the lady coming first.
I actually feel very shocked because I didn't expect it, but I feel very grateful to my teachers. I feel very grateful to my last year especially. I feel very grateful to Yenjang, to my school, because they all helped me. This wasn't a one-man thing. Everybody put in effort, so I feel very grateful.
All the winners of each country will go to China to have the final competition. The winner will represent this country, Nigeria, and the second place winner will just go to attend the whole competition in China. I'm sure that they will enjoy their stay and they will learn more.
It has been an extremely interesting competition. The level and the quality of the presentations have been mind-boggling. The students speak so well, and they have taken this really seriously, and the quality of their presentations have really blown my mind.
It's been 10 years now since the Confucius Institute was set up in 2 universities in Nigeria, where students could learn the Chinese language and culture. Enrollment in the institute has grown, and the University of Lagos now teaches Chinese language as a degree course, graduating its first set of Chinese language students last year. The program is helping to further entrench cultural ties between Nigeria and China. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Let's now take a quick look at your business news. Here's what's ahead. The South African rand drops to a new low as wrangles over the role of the central bank continue. And what the government is doing to restore economic growth in Angola.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
South Africa's rand fell to a new 2019 low earlier on Friday as wrangles over the role of the central bank remain unresolved within the ruling African National Congress. The currency shed 0.63% to trade at 15.09 to the dollar and bringing losses since Monday to 5%. Assurances by the ANC that the Apex Bank remains independent did little to ease nerves. The row has exposed divisions within the ANC. A group loyal to President Cyril Ramaphosa is opposed to calls from a rival faction that the bank should do more to boost employment and kickstart growth in the country's ailing economy. And still in South Africa, there are concerns that Africa's most industrialized economy could slip into a recession. As I mentioned earlier, first quarter GDP data showed the economy contracted by over 3%. That figure was way worse than what the market had expected. Most economists were predicting a decline of between 1.7% and 2%. CGTN's Sumitra Naidu takes up the story.
Many were left shocked. The 3.2% contraction in the economy is the worst decline in growth in 10 years. And the main contributing factor was the electricity shortage. South Africa suffered its worst rolling blackouts in January.
It's a spear in the side of the whole economy, and really it's driving it down into even lower depths. I think that what we're going to see is the Eskom has to complete the two big new power stations, Kusile and Madiba. They are going to have to be completed just because the amount of capital allocated already to them.
Government spend has been declining in recent years. The private sector too is holding back on capital expenditure. Investors have been waiting for new leadership to get this economy back on track, but it's no easy task. The threat of a recession is looming. A sovereign ratings downgrade may also follow.
I think there's a strong risk now that we will see a further credit rating downgrade, and especially the ominous one is that Moody's, who are the only major credit rating agency that still has us on an investment grade, may well decide to downgrade us to junk status. That may not happen this year, it may only happen next year. But the fact is that unless economic growth recovers significantly, we're likely to see all the fiscal metrics of the country deteriorate to a level where further ratings downgrade becomes unavoidable.
This economy now needs decisive leadership and political will. But economists are concerned that the government won't make the urgent changes that are needed. Instead, the ANC is now talking about changing the mandate of the Reserve Bank and introducing quantitative easing.
The one thing that they shouldn't do is threaten interference in the Reserve Bank's independence, which cuts across all hopes of increased investment by the business sector and by foreign investors who believe that the government is set on a course of still more interference in managing the economy.
It's crunch time for the president and his team. South Africans may have to endure more pain before it gets better. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Angola has had a tough time since the price of crude collapsed in 2014. The country has been in recession since 2016 and the size of the economy has shrunk significantly. Inflation also spiked and the government and the central bank have since stepped in. Angelo Coppola reports on what they are doing from Luanda.
The country's central bank governor spoke to delegates at the oil and gas conference, reminding them that until that collapse, the oil and gas sector had contributed some 40% of the country's GDP and 98% of the country's export revenue. It's clawed back some of those losses. The inflation rate has also recovered somewhat.
Last year we had an inflation of around 18.6%. This year we plan to reduce. We have had inflation at that rate for the last 3 years. It is in decline now.
The country's financial system was also severely stress-tested by the oil price collapse. Angolan financial authorities have worked with the IMF to find sustainable solutions.
We have to reinforce the resilience of our financial system in the context of a program with the IMF. We are undertaking an assessment of the quality of commercial banks' assets. We do not expect many or huge surprises, but there are many cases where we need to reinforce their capital structures.
The country's public debt has leapt from 30% in 2013 to 80% in 2018 due to the oil price collapse and a reduction in revenue. The government tightened its belt and cut costs, and then the debt figures began dropping.
You would have said that this derives from the increase in the price of oil. Of course, it has helped. We could have increased expenditure, but we didn't, because we needed to change the way the public debt moves. That surplus has helped the government to reduce the stock of domestic debt.
The government has also introduced a number of reforms.
The government has approved the antitrust law, and we believe that such a law will help improve the functioning of markets and increase the competitiveness of the national economy.
The country's financial authorities are committed to reducing its debt burden and diversifying the economy. Policies are now in place, and it's a question of discipline and staying focused on the end goal, which is sustainable, diversified economic growth. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Luanda, Angola.
In Nigeria, a new survey on access to financial services shows millions of low-income earners consider banking services a waste of time and unnecessary. The survey shows that only 36 million out of nearly 100 million Nigerian adults use the country's banking system. CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam reports.
39-year-old Musa Abdulaziz sells fruits in Garki Market in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. He's among millions of Nigerians who resent the banking system. Most of them are in the informal sector. A new survey on access to financial services shows at least 36.8% of Nigerian adults are not included in the banking system. The survey says most of them do not like the numerous requirements for account opening. They also lack disposable income to take to the banks.
You see, if my goods are finished, I will have to go back to replace my stock. I don't need to take money to the bank. How will I pay for my supply? If my profits accumulate so that I have extra to go to the market, then I can go to the bank. But at this moment, I'm not ready for a bank account. I don't have savings.
The financial system's exclusion is even worse in the northern part of Nigeria, where the unbanked population doubles those in the south. Rampant poverty, insecurity and lack of financial literacy is blamed for the low access to financial systems there. The findings of the survey is alarming, but financial experts think it could have grossly underestimated the scale of financial systems exclusion in the country.
Probably have close to about 90 million accounts in the country. But in terms of the number of persons who own those accounts and businesses who own those accounts, it's actually in the region of about 30 million. So that will give you a far higher percentage of people who are excluded.
The latest findings is an improvement of 4.2% from 2016, but it shows how much more work is yet to be done. Experts are recommending the integration of digital transaction platforms, especially for low-income earners and those in far-flung parts of the country, to draw a significant number of the people into the formal financial system.
We also have to develop more platforms for transactions, for conducting financial transactions without the mediation of cash, so that if more transactions can be done digitally, then more people will tend to want to also get onto those platforms because it's going to be easier and the rest of that. So you have to create those kind of incentives and a condition that makes it like it becomes a burden, for example, to carry cash around, or it becomes a burden, it's far easier.
Nigeria's National Financial Exclusion Strategy aims at reducing financial systems exclusion to 20% by 2020. That target looks out of reach considering the rate of success being recorded. The country will have to pursue some aggressive strategies and set itself a more realistic target. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
And we still have more news for you here on the program. Here's what's ahead. A special exhibition in Nigeria gives women artists a platform to showcase their talent.
So your parking is higher?
Yeah.
就是面对异国婚姻还是挺难的。
到时间我就得离开，然后舍弃这里所有的东西。
Yes,
我很想看看这个世界，很想了解不同的地方的文化。
不管你在哪里，你都可以创